Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Kataly Foundation's webinar today. Welcome to Building Power Through Collective Healing and Transformation, a conversation on the mindfulness and healing justice work here at Kataly. We'll be getting started shortly. My name is Kimmy Mojica. I'm the Consulting Director for Justice Funders, and it is an honor and pleasure to be here with you all this morning. We're asking you to put into the chat, let us know who you are, where you are landing from, and what is keeping you grounded today. There's a huge community here that's joining us, and we are so delighted to have you all. So thank you so much. I'm going to remind folks to, in the chat box when you are posting, just ensure that your tab is clicked on to everyone, just so that we can hear your message loud and clear for all of us that are on the webinar call today. I'm going to ask folks to settle in. Please be engaged in the chat box. We'll be fielding questions as well. Yes, we are just excited and joyful to welcome you into this space. I'm going to hand it off to Donna Bradford, who's the Senior Director of the Mindfulness and Healing Justice Portfolio, as well as the Director of Learning and Culture at Kataly. Donna, I'm inviting you to start us off. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much, Kimmy. Welcome, everybody. So excited to see so many familiar names and new names as well in the chat. And I think what I was going to do was first introduce our team here in the Mindfulness and Healing Justice Program team. So I'm Donna Bransford. I'm the Director of Culture and Learning at Kataly. I wear two hats at Kataly, and also I'm the Senior Program Officer for the Mindfulness and Healing Justice Program. I'm joined today by my colleague, Larry Yang, who is a Senior Advisor to the Mindfulness and Healing Justice team, and has taught mindfulness and meditation retreats nationally, and has done social and racial justice work within Black, Indigenous, and communities of color and dominant culture communities for over 20 years. Larry has trained teachers for spiritual leadership within communities of color and LGBTQI communities for 15 years. We're also joined by Kimmy Mojica, who's our MC today. And as Kimmy said, Kimmy's the Consulting Director at Justice Funders, as well as a trainer, mediator, and coach in their own practice. And we're also lucky to have Kimmy as a program consultant on the team with us. And we're also joined by Chris Olin. Chris is a board member of Kataly and collaborates with the Mindfulness and Healing Justice Program team on our strategy and funder organizing and how to best support our grantee partners. And ultimately, the grant decisions are made by the program team, as Kataly board members are not actually involved in grant decision making as part of Kataly's commitment to the redistribution of both wealth and power. So that's our team. And I think we're gonna do a little switcheroo on the screen sharing for a minute. Great. So I'm gonna now share my screen. I can do that. Great. So I am going to go ahead and I'm going to talk a little bit about the Mindfulness and Healing Justice Program at Kataly. And then Larry is going to talk some bit about the program. And then we're going to have really the bulk of the time that we're going to spend today, really spent hearing from 3 of our grantee partners. And we're so excited to be able to have you be able to hear from them today. So I'm going to just jump in talking about kind of some of the areas where we are doing grant making in the program. So supporting community-based mindfulness programs and spaces that are led by and created for Black, Indigenous, and communities of color to practice. Supporting teacher training and leadership development and kind of train the trainers work for Black, Indigenous, and leaders of color, specifically within mindfulness and contemplative practice and healing justice spaces, really as a way to kind of build the bench for resourcing more leaders of color within those spaces. And then, I'm sorry, I'm adjusting my screen here, healing justice programs and spaces that are really focused on collective transformation. So doing work that is supporting individual healing, but is also really focused on collective healing and transformation that is building towards collective power. And let's see. Oh, Sorry. So we've been doing this work. We've had about 3 rounds of grant making. And in those 3 rounds, we have had some learnings and some shifts that we have made within the program that I just wanted to share. In the first year of the program, particularly within the mindfulness space, we supported some work that was led by people of color, but housed within mainstream organizations, and really recognized some of the limitations of doing that work, I think, particularly for the leaders of color within those organizations. And within the mindfulness space, that was important to do because there really wasn't that much, there weren't that many organizations led by folks of color. But in recognizing a lot of those limitations and challenges, we really focused on saying, okay, we are going to be supporting only organizations that are led by Black, Indigenous, and people of color who are really building new systems for our communities, as opposed to kind of focusing on retrofitting the old systems. And I want to acknowledge that when I say new systems in there, for a lot of our communities, what that really means is reclaiming and remembering and kind of bringing back ancient wisdom and ancient technologies, and really ancient ways of being into doing this work. So folks who are really deeply rooted in their own community's ancestral practices and bringing those practices into the work. And so we are also really excited about work that is really drawing from those deep wells of community tradition and cultural traditions to kind of be recreating the new, if you will. We also decided to explicitly name healing justice as part of the program to make sure that Black, Indigenous, and communities of color saw the work that they were doing in this space as really recognized and supported within this program. And so we wanted to make that clear, and added the healing justice name to the program to make that more explicit for folks to understand. We also really then focused on saying, we really want to be looking at work that is deeply rooted within Black, Indigenous, and communities of color, and that has an analysis of systemic oppression. So with work that is really like the North Star of the work is not just about individual self-care, though that's important, but it's also about collective care and collective transformation, and is really building power towards that kind of collective liberation work. I'm going to read a quote here that is from a healing justice toolkit that the Justice Teams Network and Dignity and Power Now put together. So those are two organizing groups that really do their organizing work with a healing justice frame. And I'll just read, resilience is strategic. We support the healing of our communities, not only because we deserve well-being, but also because the power required to win our people's well-being is the power required to win all other visionary demands for justice. And I think that's just such a beautiful and simple way to explain the work that we are trying to do and we're trying to support. I'm going to name, I skipped ahead. So for Kataly, I want to name a little bit of how we feel like we are seeing the niche in the work that we're doing. And so really looking at seeding emerging Black, Indigenous, and leaders of color in organizations who are kind of really helping to launch new work, and recognizing in that historically philanthropy has not really shown up to be the first funder for Black, Indigenous, and leaders of color as they're starting new work in their communities. And often our communities have to kind of prove themselves before they get philanthropic support. And we're excited to kind of flip that on its head and actually be able to be a seed funder supporting Black, Indigenous, and leaders of color and communities as they are launching new work and new projects. We're also really interested in looking at how are we building and strengthening an ecosystem of this work. So just in the same way that on the individual level, while individual self-care and healing is important, we're really looking at community transformation and community healing and collective healing. In the same way with the grantee partners, we're really looking at, yes, supporting the capacity of individual organizations, but then how are we also supporting an ecosystem of organizations and those connective tissues between organizations, and what's the impact that those individual groups have on the greater whole. And I'm just excited to share that even in that work of supporting some of those projects within mainstream organizations in those last 3 years, over 98% of our grants have been made to Black, Indigenous, and people of color led organizations, or to projects serving those communities. And as we kind of refine and hone that work, really starting with this year and moving forward, we're going to be moving into a space where 100% of our grants are going to be to organizations that are led by Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And in this moment, I want to just kind of call out as I'm talking about that. If folks haven't seen it, the Philanthropic Initiative for Racial Equity has a new report that they just launched and had an awesome webinar a couple of weeks ago, I guess. It's called Mismatched: Philanthropy's Response to the Call for Racial Justice. And I don't have time to really talk more about it, but just as we're talking about supporting racial equity and racial justice work, I would just really encourage folks to check out that report, because it's really, Pri has done some amazing analysis, has been doing this work for a long time in the field. So appreciate their leadership in that space. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the way that we at Kataly are trying to kind of really step into trust-based practices and solidarity philanthropy. And I want to acknowledge that there are many folks with us on this call, many funders who are really embodying those trust-based and solidarity philanthropy principles and practices. And so we are in partnership, in collaboration with you in doing that work. And that we stand on the shoulders of so many folks who have been advocating in the field for those types of practices. And so we're excited to get to implement many of those practices in our grant making that folks have been advocating for in the field for a long time. And so some of the ways that we're trying to step into that work, we're really trying to minimize hurdles for grantees. And so reducing paperwork, doing less burdensome monitoring. And so not asking for written reports, but asking for just doing phone calls with people. So we're really engaging folks in a relational basis, trying to build relationship and build trust, having conversations with folks where we're learning about what's working, what's not working, and also trying to reduce just the amount of work and paperwork that they're doing for us. Trying to really create space for what the historian Robin D.G. Kelly calls freedom dreaming. So he talks about making the space for leaders to be able to envision and imagine the world where our people are free and the world that we want to create. And when folks can do that, to be able to then imagine the world and then forge the pathway to get there. And how can we as funders help to create that space for people to do that freedom dreaming? And I would say one way we can do that is by providing them with general operating large multi-year grants, right? So that they have the space to actually do the work and engage in the work and engage in the envisioning, as opposed to spending a lot of time doing paperwork for us, right? And so we're really stepping deeply into trying to do that, all general operating grants and multi-year grants to create that space for leaders. One of the things also we're just seeing, really understanding kind of increased needs for capacity building support. I think especially as we are stepping into seeding organizations and seeding kind of new work and new leadership. We're seeing that there's a real need for capacity building amongst a lot of organizations. And so just wanting to really think about that and think about what are some of the other ways that we are able to support organizations in addition to the funding. And lastly, I'll share also really wanting to sit with our own discomfort as funders as folks are going through some of those struggles, right? And so I think often funders get into positions where there's changes or challenges or struggles happening in organizations, and we as funders kind of freak out about it. And how can we kind of sit with our own discomfort around that, those moments with organizations, and really hold organizations through some of those challenges, to sit with them for the long term. And have them understand that they are being held by us and that we are engaging in that trust, so that they feel comfortable sharing some of those challenges with us, knowing that we're going to be there and continue to support them in the work. And so I'm going to close with a quote from Ine Begay, who is the executive director at Native Movement, and is also a member of the Environmental Justice Resourcing Collective here at Kataly. And so that is a fund that is led by 9 women of color environmental justice leaders who are making the grant decisions for that fund. And Ine was talking about the 3 different strategies that they're focusing on in their grant making. So power building, healing, and infrastructure. And she named that all of those are key aspects to our communities thriving for the long term, and that one can't be done without the other. And in talking about the deep, deep trauma that so many people in our communities face, she noted there's a deep need for healing in the spiritual holding of the sacred, of holding ceremony. And this is so critical to our work for building justice. It is so critical for the long term. So we emphasize the need to take time to support our communities in building those spaces and taking the time to heal and taking the time to build ceremony and what is sacred and structuring our work around that spiritual center. And I wanted to share this quote because it's so beautiful. And I feel like what Ine is kind of showing, demonstrating for us is movement leaders and grassroots leaders, they deeply understand that healing and contemplative practice and spiritual practice are not divorced from social justice practice, right? They're not two different funding areas that need to be funded separately. And so, recognizing that they really are part and parcel of the same work, and that the healing work creates the conditions for folks to be able to step into power and to be able to transform those systems of oppression. And I think that movement leaders and grassroots leaders are really asking us as funders to fund their work holistically, to be able to step fully into that long-term change work. And I just hope that we as funders can really listen to what movements are asking and to really heed that call. And so I'm going to stop there. And let's see, I'm going to stop sharing, and I am going to, I think, turn it over to my colleague, Larry.
Thank you, Donna, and thank you, Kimmy. And I would just want to take a minute to thank Amaka and Regan and Chris and all of our Kataly community for this incredible opportunity to contribute to the well-being of the intersectionality of diverse BIPOC communities. I so appreciate Kataly because as a queer BIPOC community leader, most of the time I have to explain or justify not only what I believe, but also who I am and what my life experience is. At Kataly, because I've had the direct experience of not being second guessed or critiqued for any of that, that is what I can also offer the grantee partners with whom I work. What I'm describing is the trust of trust-based philanthropy. Trust is not the sole territory of trust-based philanthropy because it is an indivisible territory of being human. This abundance of trust allows the authenticity and integrity of one's own experience to flow into our work that is so very needed in this world. And my belief from my own experience is that in order to have our maximum impact, that trust needs to be woven not only into the experience with our grantee partners, but also experience within the grant-making organization itself and experienced internally within each of us as individuals. So more to say about that individual to collective process. And I will share my screen now too. Oops. Excuse me. So I'll be talking about the funding and supporting of social justice movement building. And as Donna ended her presentation with Ine's quote and a description of that, one of the foundations of our work is that spiritual and contemplative practice are indispensable to the social justice transformation and movement building. And so in this slide, you can see the convergence of mindfulness and healing justice and the components of it that mindfulness and contemplative practice are spiritual foundations. And these are core principles in every spiritual tradition that I'm aware of across the globe. And this spiritual foundation creates the ability for social transformation and healing justice, as we have seen over and over again in the generational work that our world has experienced. And I just have two examples on the lower part of the slide around the role of the African American church in the civil rights movement, the role of liberation theology in the liberation movements and fronts in Latin America. But there are innumerable examples of this, from the nonviolent efforts against British colonialism in India, to the indigenous and native resistance to British colonialism in Southeast Asia. There are many examples of this connection between the wellspring of spiritual practice and what we do in the world to make it better. Because we know that that work is very draining. And unless our wells have that deep sense of resilience and resourcing, we will burn out, not just individually, but also collectively. So some of the values that we bring to our work is this sense of interconnectivity and interconnection as a given. That is where we start from. From that, we develop the relationship and trust as keystone. And the keystone is the central portion of any arch that is built. It is an indispensable portion of our relationships in building movement forward. And that we look at the collective whole as an awareness practice, because our collective unconsciousness in the dominant culture defaults to individual success and achievement and awareness. It takes an effort to bridge that individual awareness into the largesse of the larger world and our collective consciousness. And that's where Kataly believes that it can support, facilitate, build capacity, and create forward movement collectively. So with that, with those values of interconnection, relationship, trust, collective whole, and support, we are not only interested in our dominant culture's value of this phrase that I've recently learned of optimizing the individual personal experience, not even the individual personal experiences of our individual grantee partners. That phrase comes from one of our grantee partners, actually, who's a grad student, and I appreciate learning from our grantee partners in that way, that we have this additional focus on the ecosystem of our grantee partners and the whole of the movement. So this next slide hopefully shows it's pretty compact. I'm not sure I'll be able to deconstruct all of it in this short time that I have, but I will start and I have not been able to fit into this space all of our grantees. So my apologies to those who are not called out in this particular slide. But I'll start with the BIPOC community impact, with these programs that we've funded that develop the capacity and the strength and experiential healing within the communities, gatherings of power, gatherings and conferencing to build community together among the Latinx indigenous gatherings, the Pan-Asian AAPI efforts that we're making, a healing trauma project within BIPOC communities to cultivate resilience, which is the one of the antidotes of trauma, cultivating the skills of community building itself within the East Point Peace Academy, as well as Mindfulness for All, and redefining relationships to land, race, money, and spirit that Jubilee Justice Journeys and Peace Editing Pace does. And from that community work, inevitably brings the work to develop leadership, empowering teachers of color within mindfulness-based stress reduction frameworks and communities, and insight meditation communities that never had this focus previously. BIPOC and BAME focus on leadership training across North America. Black Organizing for Leadership and Dignity, Braided Wisdom, which is a confluence of indigenous and wisdom traditions. The Black Embodiment Initiative, which Prentis will speak to later in our webinar. The Emergent Teachers Fund, specifically for BIPOC and diverse emerging leaders who, again, feeling the trust in their empowerment from someone that holds their back is not something that we as BIPOC leaders have when we step into our leadership. What would it be like to empower teachers and then support them further? So that is that project in development and execution. And then creating leadership from the community itself with projects like Creating Freedom Movements out of Oakland. This is empowering communities with the ability to future vision and dream. And then moving to the top circle, this BIPOC dedicated space of retreat centers, land ownership, capital campaigns, and investment. We are not just moving financial resources, but what do those financial resources mean in our culture? And that is power. And that is the empowering communities with a steadfastness in our own future. And as you can see, these circles have multiple relationships. They affect each other, and they affect the totality at the same time. So all of this is about focusing, and I'm going to have to be short in this explication, but focusing on the distinction between racial justice and racial equity. To equalize the amount of resources or to create equity in representation, for example, in demographics, is not sufficient, because equity does not inherently change a system that causes harm. Success within a system is not necessarily changing. It is racial justice that creates social change by shifting what money represents in our culture. And that is the power and the empowerment for which we use for the transformation that arcs towards justice. So we talk about the ecosystem. We talk about not just individual grantee partners, but the relationships between them, that they can support each other, as well as how we can support the collective whole. And so this slide is just a sampling of our grantee partners. And we totally acknowledge that before Kataly even existed, they had networks and relationships and ways that they supported each other. And so this is an approximation of some of those existing relationships from the movement that we stand on shoulders of. And some of the partners are emerging, so they may not have the interconnections, or they're isolated in different ways because of the exclusion of dominance. And then the next slide is really what Kataly has been able to suggest, develop, bridge, strengthen, weave, and bring together for future momentum of the movement. Sometimes we have been able to do this very intentionally, and sometimes it is just serendipity, because that's what life also includes, is we're surprised at the interconnectivity that begins to emerge when we invite it as an intention. Now, I just want to say that this slide is not a data point. It is an impression impact. It's the colors don't mean a particular thing. The length of the lines don't mean a particular thing. It is the impression that I want to share with you of what is possible. So going back to that slide that describes the collective whole, we are trying not to optimize not just the individual experience, but of the larger whole. What if foundations were as connected, interconnected as the grant partners, even within this ecosystem? How could interconnected networks impact our foundation and grant making work and our visions? This slide is to suggest the networking of all of our ecosystems and what might be possible. Each circle representing the network and the interconnections and the ecosystem of that particular foundation's work. And what would be possible if we network those networks, those connections of interconnections, those networks of ecosystems, moving the movement forward together rather than individually or separately. So I'll end with this quote and this aphorism that comes from Adrienne Marie Brown's work. When she began to realize how important emergent strategy was for building complex patterns and systems through relatively small interactions, which every single one of those lines in those slides represents. It's a small interaction, but small things many times. I'll say that again, small things many times. Can you feel embedded in both Ms. Brown's statement and this pithy aphorism, the trust in our collective future? What would it be like for communities, not just individuals, to feel a deep trust? What would it be like for communities to trust other communities, bridging any differences? Collective trust is one path to how we change ourselves, to how we change our communities, to how we change philanthropy, and to how we change our world. So thank you very much for your time and your attention. And I will now turn it over back to our facilitator, Kimmy.
Thank you so much, Donna and Larry. I'm going to ask y'all to just take a deep breath and let this wash over you. What does it mean to live into collective trust? Just take a breath here and receive this. Try and feel your feet on the floor in this moment. Thank you, Donna and Larry. I think while we are now giving you the context and a bit of the background around what is happening at the Mindfulness and Healing Justice team and the work and our analysis, really this work comes to life and is really the breadth of this work exists in the grantees and our partners who are doing the work in community on the ground. And they are the ones who are stewarding mindfulness and healing justice in the world and proliferating it, not only in their own personal communities, but for the world. So I am so privileged and delighted to have here our three folks, amazing people. First, Tracy Stewart, who's a therapist and healer and co-director and founding member of Gathering Roots Retreat and Wellness Center in Washington. We also have Prentis Hemphill, teacher and somatic coach and conflict transformation facilitator and founder of the Embodiment Institute. And last but not least, Kazu Haga, who's the founder of the East Point Peace Academy, a core member of the Hemphill Collective, and author of Healing Resistance, a radically different response to harm. We are so delighted that they've taken their time and energy to be with us today. I'm going to ask each of them to introduce a little bit about themselves and their work. You will see their links on the chat box as the folks are presenting, and if there's any questions that do come up, please go ahead and use the Q&A chat box function. We are monitoring that, and our hope is to get to a few Q&A questions at the end of our conversation today. So I'm going to pass it first. Let's pass it first to Kazu, and then Prentis and Tracy.
Thank you, Kimmy and Donna and Larry, for all of that. Good evening, middle of the night. I'm actually zooming in from Taiwan, New Taipei City. So good to be with you all in what's getting to be a late night, but definitely didn't want to miss this evening. So I work with an organization called the East Point Peace Academy. Good to see many of our friends' names on the chat. I kind of mourn. I know the webinar thing has lots of things, a lot of technologies that it offers, but I really miss being able to see all your faces. So hello to everyone that's out there. So the East Point Peace Academy, it's a play on words of the military academy at West Point. I have the privilege to have been trained by a lot of elders in the civil rights movement. And specifically, I spent a lot of time with an elder named Dr. Bernard Lafayette, who was one of the leaders of the Nashville lunch counter sit-in movement. And as you all may know, the leaders of the Nashville movement was trained in nonviolence by the Reverend James Lawson for over 6 months before they were allowed to do their first protest. That's how seriously they took training. And at East Point, we believe that social change isn't something that just happens overnight. It has to be done through practice and training and strategizing. And so historically, it felt like we did two separate programs. One of them was going into the prisons and county jails throughout California, as well as a lot of schools around here in the Bay Area that were dealing with violence, and working with them to try to empower those communities to build a culture of peace, a restorative culture. And then on the other side, we work with activists and social movements to integrate nonviolence into their work and to build more capacity in their movements. And more, those two pieces are coming together for us. And I think right now our work is really at the intersection of trauma healing and direct action. The million-dollar question that we always ask ourselves is, what could nonviolent direct action look like if we viewed it as a modality of collective trauma healing? And we're trying to do that by attempting to build movements where, I think one of the core things is we're trying to build movement spaces where nobody, including those on the other side of the conflict, where nobody would even think to question their sense of belonging. And I think if we can create a movement that has the power to match the escalation of the harm and the destruction that's out there while doubling down on a commitment to healing and belonging, then deep transformation may be possible. So that's a little bit about our work, and look forward to sharing more.
Great, I'm gonna invite Tracy and then Prentis.
Hello, everyone. I'm Tracy Stewart. I'm co-director of Gathering Roots Wellness. And We started out in 2019 with an idea of, hey, let's buy a big old house and some land and have a retreat center for BIPOC folks so that we don't have to be under white gaze and all the garbage that we have to go through with scholarships and all the things every time we try to go to a retreat. And oh, hey, let's expand that and let's be about wellness in general so that all the teachers in our community who have to rent an Airbnb and sometimes get canceled when they show up as their brown selves don't have to experience that. So we rooted around for 2 years looking for the right place, and we in April purchased 78 acres of land here in Washington, which was the largest land purchase by Black people in the history of the state of Washington. And our intention is to utilize that space for Black, Indigenous, and other people of color to have safer space to come together to do transformative work around intergenerational trauma, what wellness looks like to us, our cultural practices, and cultural sharing with one another, all through art and music and transformative conversation so that we can move into our better selves and have a sense of ourselves from ourselves. That's pretty much it. I mean, sure, there's a lot more, but I'll stop there. Pass it to you, Prentis.
Thanks, Tracy, and thank you, Kazu, and thank you to the organizers of this call and everybody on the call. It's really great to be with you all. I got really excited about what you were just sharing, Tracy, and also Kazu. It feels like so much alignment and synergy and amazing things that are happening in the world, and grateful to Kataly for convening us in this way. My work is, so my training is as an organizer and also as a therapist. And similarly to the folks that have shared, I have been interested in understanding how our individual and collective bodies transform, and how from that transformation we can build power and we can lead and we can have the things that we need as communities. So I've really focused on trauma healing and embodied trauma healing, which basically says it's not enough to have a good idea about what we should do or how we should be or what healing takes, that it actually has to recruit or center or hold our bodies as central in any transformative process. And so the work that we do at the Embodiment Institute overall is about building and developing our embodied practices and embodied relational skills that we believe support more just relationships in the world, more just action in the world. The Black Embodiment Initiative in particular is a space for Black folks to come together, to heal together, to practice together, and to deepen our relationships. We have been around, I think, just since the end of 2020. Yep, time is a strange thing right now. But we have done a good number of trainings where we are convening community, and we're also doing some cultural intervention pieces. How are we thinking about trauma healing? How are we thinking about what wellness is? How are we holding what conflict is and could be, and trying to make those shifts collectively so that we are able to enter into these spaces and lead as powerfully as we, I think, are intended to lead in this time.
Thank you so much, Prentis, Tracy, and Kazu for giving us a bit of insight into your work. I want to dive into some questions here that we had in our previous discussions of just that mindfulness and healing justice. I'm going to invite also Tracy to come on screen too with us. But mindfulness and healing justice work is often discussed as only being an about individual self-care and transformation, or personal restoration per se. And you all are doing amazing work in community that's building upon each other and connecting within particularly social movements. And so would love to hear a little bit from each of you. If you can speak to your own journey in connecting the personal and collective transformation in social movement work, and how your journey has been informed and what has informed your journey. Like, I'll ask Kazu.
Okay, go. Yeah.
Go for it.
Oh, yeah, thank you. Yeah, a lot that I could say to that. You know, my story kind of oftentimes starts when I was 17 years old. I was at a point in my life where I was very traumatized. I had a pretty rough upbringing. I dropped out of high school when I was 15. I was in and out of trouble, drinking, getting high every day. And then when I was 17 years old, I heard about this Japanese Buddhist order called Nipponzan Myohoji. They happen to have a temple in the town next to where I lived. And that temple was initiating this project called the Interfaith Pilgrimage of the Middle Passage, where they were going to walk from Massachusetts down the coast to New Orleans, a group of about 60 diverse people, and then down the coast of some parts of Africa to retrace the Middle Passage and to begin to heal from that legacy, to reverse that legacy by going from the US back to Africa. And yeah, I was just a 17-year-old kid. I had nothing better to do. I was bored with my life. And so I heard about it about a week before it started and told my mom that I would check it out for the first week, because I was like, why not? And I ended up leaving home for a year and a half, spending 6 months on that walk, and then a year spending time in their monasteries between India, Nepal, and Sri Lanka. And so from the beginning of my journey, it was always at the intersection of mindfulness and spiritual practice and intergenerational healing and politics and systemic violence. So it was always like this one holistic thing for me. But when I came back from that experience, I jumped into social change work. And what was accessible to me at the time was mass mobilizations, right? So I became a nonviolence trainer. I started preparing people to go into mass demonstrations against the WTO and the IMF and World Bank, School of Americas. And it was a time in like activist culture that I felt like even talking about spirituality was super taboo. Like we weren't even singing, like even singing songs together was like, people would look at you funny, like, what kind of California woo-woo hippie thing is this? And it was also a place where I saw a lot of trauma and harm being perpetuated over and over again. And I'm really happy to see that in the last 5-10 years, like a resurgence of song culture, like we're singing again in our movements. That wasn't the case 20 years ago. And really understanding that kind of the importance of synthesizing spiritual work and healing work with justice work. I'll just share one last quick story. About 10 years ago, when I started like having a deeper commitment to my own healing journey, I was at this place called the Jam, which some of you may be familiar with. They're like transformative experiences, week-long gatherings with change makers. And I talked about a childhood traumatic experience that I've never talked about out loud with anybody before. And up to that point in my life, I thought that I had gotten over it because it's something that happened like 20 years prior. And so I was like, whatever, it's over it. I'm healed, you know? And when I talked about it out loud for the first time, I completely broke down and I could barely get a breath in. And it made me realize how heavy this weight was that I'd been carrying around for 20 years. And a lot of it had to do with the shame that I was feeling for not being there for my family more when things were hard when I was young, you know? And that, like, being able to talk about that more and having processed that was such a huge burden lifted off my shoulders. And I oftentimes talk about how like I always, like my body always knew that I carried the shame, and it takes a great deal of spiritual energy to constantly suppress a truth that our bodies know to be true. And I think collectively that is what's happening in this country. The Interfaith Pilgrimage of the Middle Passage showed me that like collectively, this nation, I mean, I'm not there now, but the United States has deep collective shame around its history. And it's constantly sapping our creativity and our ability to heal ourselves by like suppressing it. And so I think collective action at its best is creating spaces that are brave enough and safe enough for the nation to have a conversation about its most shameful things in the way that I had to learn how to do. And so, yeah, I think that like the things that have helped move me towards healing, it's the same thing that needs to happen collectively, just at a different scale. So that's a little bit of how I think about things. I'll pause there for now.
Thank you, Kazu. Tracy, I want to invite you to get in here because this is definitely something that you've talked about as well around funding healing to scale. So tell us a little bit about your journey and how you connected it to your collective work.
The journey is long. It started with protests in high school over some crazy mural that went up in our school. Was nurtured during college by mentors at the Department of Health, who I then worked with professionally after college, and the Black women's health movement, and looking to ancestors like Fannie Lou Hamer and Harriet Tubman, who are frequently called because they laid down the gauntlet on unapologetic care for our community and demanding um, for us to have seats at the table for our care, however that needs to show up. So none of us are new. I mean, none of the work that any of us do is new. This work has been around for a super, super long time, and it'll be around after us. I want to jump on something that Kazu said about collective. I started out as a teacher, and then saw the trauma in my students, and so I decided to become a school counselor, and saw even more trauma in my students, and weren't enough therapists and community to refer them to, so I became a therapist in community. And then what I've learned as a therapist in community is that we are collective people being asked to heal individually, and that's not what we do. I mean, we do, but the power is in community. And whenever white supremacy comes into play in our worlds, it's to break us apart from our culture, it's to break us apart from our community, it's to seed distrust. You know, our work in decolonizing the way we think and talk is hard work because it's the water that we swim in, right? So the journey has been long, and I have so many ancestors that laid that path for me. And I believe in the interconnectedness of the work with other cultures outside of my own, because today it's me, next week it's someone else, you know, and like we can see that in the politics the last 6-7 years of this country, like who gets to be the flavor of the day for white supremacist outreach, right? Um, so I really believe in the collective work. The collective work is hard because we all bring our trauma to the table and we have difficulty talking to and with each other rather than past each other. So even just getting in a room together to trust each other, to do the work to heal our trauma is trauma, because there's so much that we come into the room with. But we need to have spaces to do that. So as a mental health therapist and a practicing Buddhist, I saw in both spaces in my life not enough places for me, not enough places for my community. And gathering roots, our original journey was to bring those things together, to create spaces for all of the wonderful people like Prentis and Kazu who are out in community doing the thing to try to heal, and to have a place to come and do it, right? That is reasonably priced, is not going to gouge you, um, charge you thousands and thousands of dollars just to hang out in a room to do your thing, right? So, and then there's of course the land. Our relationship with the land has been severed and spoiled by white-bodied supremacy. Um, you know, I'm a hiker, or I used to be before my disability, but I like being under the trees. I like being out in the woods. I like grew up with farmers, and that relationship is tainted by the history of slavery, and our relationship to the land is severed by that intense period and aftermath of chattel slavery. against my people. So it's the reclaiming of all the things of our culture, our cultural practices from a homeland that we were disconnected from, our spiritual practices, and our land practices, and trying to bring all of that back in this place, but then also celebrating our siblings from other cultures of color who've also had the same issues, but just maybe in a different way. And always honoring that where we do that is not our land, right? We own this land, but it's not our land. This belongs to the Coast Salish people. And so it's also incumbent upon us to follow the protocols of this land, of the peoples on this land, to develop those relationships. So, I mean, it's like everything. It's like all the things. But we're up to the task, and I'll stop there because I could like ramble for hours and hours and hours about how crucial it is for us to have place and space to do this work.
Absolutely. Absolutely, Tracy. And thank you both for connecting this piece around the importance of our relationship to land and relationship-centered pieces in general. I think there's also, you're talking a lot about finding the disconnects between the individual and the collective in the multiple explorations around the practices, becoming a teacher, becoming a therapist, trying to bridge things that are when you're stepping into it, you're saying, oh, why aren't we doing this? Why isn't the individual and collective happening at the same time at the scale that we need it to? And that is actually bringing me a little bit to our conversation, Prentis, where I feel like you probably have a lot to add into this too, around how your story, which I'm sure is intertwined or has some resonance with what Tracy and Kazu are naming too. So I want to give you an opportunity to share a little bit about your journey and how you're landing into this larger piece about collective liberation as well.
Happy to, thank you. I think really where my story begins is that I was probably, no, I wasn't probably, I was deeply depressed for about 25 years, to be honest. And that was because of growing up in a household where there was a lot of violence, but also growing up in the middle of drug wars and the attacks on the community that I grew up in. Also growing up in really intense poverty in a southern town in Texas in the 80s. And so when I got to movement, when I was organized into movement, it was the first time that I had felt a sense of agency, a sense that I could actually change the conditions that had impacted me so much, and impacted not just me, but so many other people around me had similar stories or similar things that they were dealing with. That's where it becomes a collective. We start to see the themes inside the collective. But it wasn't until organizing. I studied history as a young kid. I was really into history, but I didn't actually think that we could do those things now. I didn't actually know who was doing those things now. And so when I was organized, it was actually a really healing process to be organized into an organization that was saying there are changes we can make. We can restore and recover our agency and our self-determination, because so much of that had been lost in all the experiences of trauma that I had had growing up. When I got into movement, though, a lot of what Kazu was saying was resonating with me. At that time, to engage in healing work, I was doing therapy kind of quietly on the side. I'd go see my therapist because what I was dealing with was untenable. But it was kind of a secret thing because of the serious organizers that I was friends with or worked with were not doing that. The work was in what you're doing now and into the future, but to really excavate and go into your own interior and say, this is what is impeding my ability to have relationships. This is what's impeding my ability to believe in this future that we are collectively saying that we want. This is impeding my ability to show up consistently. All of these things that I'm, like Kazu was saying, suppressing and doing this work of pushing down, is actually shaping my capacity to be here. But we weren't at that time looking at that. that wasn't okay. I lost friendships actually when I started to say, I think healing is important. People were like, oh, you're one of those now. You're one of those people that's always talking about healing. So I would say that I was deeply shaped by that. And I could see how much pain other folks were holding, how much pain I was holding, how much pain our elders were holding. A lot of the work that I was doing was around incarceration and abolition. And I could see that our elders in the movement who had been inside for significant periods of time were holding so much trauma. And we were asking them to come straight into organizing as though that was the only thing that was going to address what they were holding. At the same time, when I was doing therapy work, it was our worldview was limited almost to what was inside of the room. We weren't able to engage meaningfully in what was happening, conditions, history, all of these things. So there's limitations at the time I was coming up, both in the organizing world and in this therapeutic or healing world at that time. And so, I think what we're talking about, it has always been done. And I think we're at this moment where so much has been obscured from us that we are doing this work of weaving these things back together. This kind of imagining that we have that we can just heal individually and the conditions in the world won't impact us or re-traumatize us or traumatize the people around us is one that emerges from this kind of capitalistic culture, that you can just individually be okay and not be impacted by all of this. I actually think what has been deeply taken from us is our awareness of relationships. So our awareness of relationship with land, our awareness of relationship with one another, our relationship with ourselves. That relationship has been so obscured from us that we don't develop the kinds of relationships internally that are necessary for us. And we aren't able to stay present and be present in relationships with each other. And I guess the last thing I will say, I want to say two quick things, is that I think it was Tracy's point that oftentimes we're being asked to address things individually when they're collective. Sometimes there are things, I think, that are too big for one body to feel. And that's why we've had ritual. That's why all of us come from communities that have ritual, that allow us to feel and align and restore possibility together. We grieve together, all of these things. So the individualism has cut us off from relationship and also culture that restores us and that aligns our embodiment, all these magical things that culture can do. And I think it's just really important for us to know that. And when we are not engaged in the work of healing or this culture work that I'm talking about, because that's really what it's about for me, those are all the places where we lose power, where we leak power. When we're talking about power building and building collective power, it gets lost in the breakdowns that we have in relationships. It gets lost in our inability to maintain and hold on to a vision. It gets lost in all of these things that trauma undoes. So there is no disconnection between healing work and power building. It is how it all happens. It's what makes it have meaning. It's how we restore. It's all of the things that are the glue, I think, for our movements and for our communities.
I love this, Prentis. Thank you so, so much. I think, yes, I've seen the applause here. I'm hearing this too in terms of just like what happens when we aren't connecting the healing work with our power building work and just naming explicitly how connected they are. So just, I would want us to just have y'all be in conversation for a bit of just how is mindfulness and healing justice work part and parcel of organizing and power building in collective transformation. Y'all are making those connections loud and clear. Now I want to give you all an opportunity to dive a little deeper. I know folks have talked about conflict transformation work, like how do we stay in relationships? Folks have also mentioned here about the need to recognize that one body cannot hold all the collective healing or the grief that is held from like systemic oppression, from the scale in which violence is occurring on communities. So just want to give you all a little bit of space here to just connect with each other, build on what you have just talked about, but really about this piece around healing justice work, our healing work in power building and organizing, and just asking for more thoughts around that.
Yeah, I'd love to build a little bit about, build on what's being shared. A friend of mine has been talking about this for several years. I don't think he's actually going to do it ever at this point, but he's been threatening to write an article titled "Climate Honesty is Spiritual Practice." That it actually takes a certain depth of spiritual practice to actually look at the depth of the crisis that we are in, and to actually look at not just our own individual trauma, but the generations of trauma that need to be healed. Like, for us to tap into that grief and that fear without completely breaking requires what both Tracy and Prentis were saying about relationships and healing and relationship to land and all of that. Like, at the smallest level, I think trauma disconnects us from our whole selves, right? Like, before I started my own journey, which I'll never end, but my own journey around healing my own childhood trauma, like, that part of myself, I just kept locked up in a closet somewhere. And so I wasn't even like interconnected with my own self, never mind connected with other people or with land and things like that. And I think at the largest level, so much of spiritual practice is about having this embodied knowledge, this knowing of our interconnection, that we are part of something larger. That I believe, Larry was talking about interconnection being a foundation. Like, I believe interconnection to be a universal law of the universe in the same way that gravity is. I'm fascinated, it's a whole other thing, but I'm fascinated by the fact that there's a bunch of like flat earthers in the world again. Like, it's a whole movement that's rebuilding. And some of these people don't believe in gravity, right? It doesn't matter if they don't believe in gravity, they're still governed by the laws of gravity because it's a universal law of nature. It's dharma. And I think interdependence, interconnection it's a truth about reality. Whether you believe it or not, we're governed by its laws. And I think the more we can deepen in our spiritual practice, the more we can be in an embodied knowing of that. And I think that can kind of change the framework of how we go about our organizing work as well.
Tracy, Prentis.
It's just such a big question. Like, okay, where to begin?
What does your heart want to say?
Well, it's like this. What my heart wants to say is that we need to be funded to do the work. What my heart wants to say is when we're writing grants, it's demoralizing. What I appreciate about our relationship with Kataly and some of the other foundations who've changed the way that they go about funding this hard work is the relational aspect of it. Let me talk to you about what I dream. Let me talk to you about the work that I'm doing now. And let me talk to you about what needs to be done and how we need to get there. And there's multitudes of streams, but this is my stream. This is what I'm doing. And I don't have access to the capital that you have access to. And so what I want from you is reparations. The capital that everybody has is built on the back of my people. Let's not even pretend that it's not. The entirety of the rice industry comes out of slaves, people who were enslaved for their knowledge of how to cultivate rice. These are facts. The massive wealth that was built on the backs of my people before, during, and after, and continually. Like, now, like, we're here in this COVID situation. And what would it be like if we all just said, I'm not coming to work. You're not keeping me safe, so I'm not coming. Where's your money then? Because you're making money off of the backs of the people who are doing the thing, right? So I'm pretty intense about my desire for funds for this work. And I don't appreciate it when people of color are put in a position of begging for funds and answering really inane questions on grant application. What does this have to do with it? You want to know who I am? Give me a phone call and I will talk to you about the suffering that I see every day as a therapist of people who are falling apart because they're going into work in a white-bodied supremacist workplace and they're trying to hold it together. Now throw on top of that everything that happened before and after the intense murders of our men and women in the street, right? And then now let's talk about health inequity. Oh, wait, let's talk about our communities are being redlined or were redlined. We were there, but now they're cool places for hipsters. So now we're getting pushed out of our communities again. You know, enough. Enough is enough. Now we're losing voting rights, the little that we already had. Like, you want to talk to me about the work, you better be prepared for my frustration and my anger. And don't expect me to, don't spiritually bypass that I need to be nice and sweet and gentle asking for money. No, I don't. Because we've been there. It didn't work. We were disrespected then. So, and the whole point of Black Lives Matter is we're just going to tell you the truth. If that truth is harmful or not harmful, but feels uncomfortable to you, okay, people are dying. So your discomfort is not my concern. If you have to sit on the highway 20 more minutes before you get to work, I'm giving you not even an inch of what my people are experiencing right now under your system, right? So when I think about the philanthropic industry, which it is, and I'm new to it, I mean, I've been a board member on a really wonderful reproductive justice organization, but running a nonprofit, woo, it has been a trip. It's a trip. And meeting very wealthy white people who have no idea about who I am as a person, and the condescension and the stereotyping and this idea that I'm going to do some kind of step and fetch it sort of act for people. No, no. What is happening for people is that they are trying to live. Like, get up in the morning, do their work, have a family, have friends. And what gets in the way of that is look at the news. And then look at some other news sources, because that's not even the tip of the iceberg. What's happening in our communities is a full frontal assault. It's been there since Jim Crow, or actually before, and it hasn't changed. It just gets a new name every generation. All these things that we have to deal with. Health apartheid, housing apartheid, legal apartheid, social justice apartheid. So what I think is important is for people to be relational, to understand the seriousness of the work that we're doing, and that the need for funding is huge. Give it all. Just like, give it all to everybody, and stop pitting organizations against each other, and stop trying to have magical Negroes like, oh, we know this person, they're really cool, we're going to give them all the money. But there's 30 other organizations out in the community doing the same work. Allow them to collaborate. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's where my spirit led me.
Yes, absolutely, Tracy. Absolutely. And we welcome it. Yes, I asked you what is on your heart, and you just told it and
There
tell
it
it.
is.
And yes, and I mean, naturally, you're getting a lot of love in this chat box from all the folks, 200 plus people here. It's why you're naming it though. The healing work, the mindfulness and healing justice work needs to be funded to scale. To
And
scale.
let me say one more thing. One of
Yeah.
the things that we know from the work that we do is it's systematically feminized. And what I mean by that is when you talk about healing work, it's like, oh, that's women's work, or that's da 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 da. It's like, how about we step out of these boxes? And just because I'm not a computer programmer, like here in Seattle, like our communities have been decimated by the tech industry because you have development going on so that we can bring more and more and more workers in, and we don't care that you have a history here. We're going to call all your mortgages, and now your community that has been a Black community for 20 years, well, actually much more longer than that, pardon me, it's gone. Like our community has just been decimated. So we value land development, we value technology, we value capitalism, we value lawyers and doctors, and like, so like we can go on and on about what is valued work. But in order for people to be, they have to have places where they can be seen and heard and heal and be in touch with themselves and with each other, or it's all going to fall apart. It all is falling apart, right? COVID just like helped like point it out a little bit more clearly. So the idea that doing this work requires us to work so hard to get the money to do the work is in and of itself a problem of white-bodied supremacy, because the work of being well and being whole is devalued. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Tracy. Prentis, Kazu and Tracy have served it up. So just how's it all landed for you too?
Hot too. Sorry.
Yes, I know.
Thank you, Tracy, because I feel like you just spoke to so many things that, yeah, I just haven't heard said in these spaces, and I just feel really grateful for that. And I feel like it makes more. It just makes more room for us all to tell the truth, because I think at the end of the day, that is what we are trying to do. So much about oppression is about people having to lie to the oppressor's face about what is happening and what the dynamics are. So to get out from underneath that and to be able to tell the truth about what these dynamics mean is just so important. I think the only thing that I would really add is how it's like, if you think about what it means when we talk about healing work for Indigenous people, for Black people, for marginalized people, for queer and trans people, for formerly incarcerated people or currently incarcerated people, when we talk about healing for our people for real, I just want you to think about what it would take to not only heal the traumas that people have, that we have experienced, and to shift our culture so that it no longer traumatizes people in these ways. If you think about that, the massiveness, think about that. What would it take? What kind of resources? How might we organize ourselves to really tend to and invite, to make room for, to make space for healing for Black people on this land? How many resources, how much time would it take to make room and space for Indigenous people to heal on this space, on this land? For all of these folks, if you really, really think about that, we wouldn't have to have a lot of the conversations we end up having, because that work is so massive. And it's not just about us individually feeling good, though it really matters to me that my people, that all people have the opportunity to live full lives where they get to be present to the lives that they have and aren't, through the mechanism of oppression and the way that trauma gets distributed to communities through oppression, don't have to be preoccupied with the ongoing traumas that just come with existence in this place. If I really care about the quality of our lives, the fullness of our lives, the presence of our lives, the ability to have and create intimacy, the ability to really feel full embodied joy. I really care about these as metrics for the work that I do. And at the same time, it's so critical that we have collective culture that invites this. What is our culture about? if it is not about healing. I say all the time, trauma is going to happen in a life. Oppression concentrates it. It concentrates it into certain bodies, into femme bodies, into disabled bodies, into trans bodies. Oppression concentrates trauma. But trauma is going to happen. So what is it that our culture should be centered around? Should it be centered around consumerism? How does that match up to the conditions of life? To what actually happens in a life? And our cultures are so, I think the cultures that we are kind of forced to practice in this time and in this place have nothing to do with what people have experienced and do actually experience. And to do that deep level of transformative work, you know, we're doing this work, this is generations of work. This is generations of remembering. This is generations of creation. These are these webs and networks of people relating to each other and something new emerging from that. This is not just you're gonna fund us for 10 years or 5 years or 3 years and we're gonna be healed. No, this is, if you think about that, what it would take to live inside of a world that no longer traumatized people intentionally, systematically, and instead centered around healing, that's a deep transformation that is going to take a lot of work, a lot of resource, a lot of time, a lot of attention. It's going to take all the things and a lot of it for us to do. And so that what was on my heart after both Kazu's and Tracy's shares, just having us reorient to what is it that we're actually talking about and what is it actually going to take.
I would like to add one, I'll stop saying one thing because they'll keep popping up. But so the thought that I just had as you were speaking, Prentis, is that what also needs to happen simultaneously is for white people to wake up. And, you know, Dr. King kind of started that conversation. The conversation has not ended. And these moments of sleep and wake are killing us, because there's this expectation that we will come into white spaces and do emotional labor to teach everybody how to stop killing us. And I know that we can't make that stop, but that needs to stop. That's also another thing that Black Lives Matter has been about, is we're not really concerned about speaking in ways that hold your feelings as priority. Because, you know, we saw from Dr. King's work that coming from a place of respectability politics got a lot done, but he gave his life for that. And his messaging is constantly twisted for the benefit of white-bodied supremacy. And so what's crucial are those small pockets, and I do mean small pockets, of groups out there that are working through a white awake curriculum, or they're doing white caucus. Wow, let's look at our stuff. You know, how do we talk in spaces where we're not the predominant voice, in white spaces that don't want to hear what we need to say? That needs to happen, and it needs to keep happening, because in all of our movements, whether it's around wellness, whether it's around abolition of the prison industrial complex, whatever the work is, it always comes back to, are white people or white-bodied people doing the work with each other to stop the systems that are killing everybody, right? And that goes along with what you were saying, Prentis. That is a huge paradigm shift, because most of the folks who I know who are activists are not interested in teaching anymore. They're not interested in having conversations where we have to explain why we don't dig being murdered by police, you know. I mean, and there's so many resources on the internet that you don't need to put us in positions. There's so many books, there's so many authors, there's so many speakers, there's so much. But I think there needs to be a bravery of our European descended siblings to look at themselves and look at each other and hold each other accountable. Like I lost a lot of faith in our country. I had very little, but I had lost a lot of faith in our country when Trump was elected. And I saw and all the madness that's happening right now. And I'm looking at at people and like, where are you? Where is your voice? Because this is dangerous for us. This is dangerous. It's not a philosophical conversation. We have people in my community standing at a bus stop being spat on or being punched or being threatened, just standing at a bus stop. It happens every day. Something happens to somebody every day, and people are not speaking up, as if George Floyd was a singular event. George Floyd is one of thousands, hundreds of thousands of men and women who are destroyed, killed, battered by this system. And it's exhausting to have conversations with folks who want me to do teaching for them. And the white folks, the Euro-descended siblings that are doing the work really need to step it up. It's easy for folks to walk away because this crap is horrid. It's ugly, it's painful, it's trauma. Stick in there and do it anyway. Especially if you want to build trust with communities of culture. You know, it's crucial.
Thank you, Tracy. And I want to get Kazu, I want to get you in here as like the last words here as we're coming up on our time. This is so rich. I think y'all, we could be here for days connecting and talking with y'all. So Kazu, I just want to open up this space one more time for you too. As you're having Prentis and Tracy's words land on your heart, what does it want to say right now?
Thank you. Yeah, we will be here for days and years and generations.
We're gonna be here, yes.
Yeah, you know, I firmly believe that none of the wisdom I have is my own. So there's a thought that's coming to me that I learned from a guy named Frederick Laroe, who talked about the difference between complicated and complex. And he said the engine of a 747 jet plane is complicated in that there's hundreds of parts, but it's logical that if you take one gear out of that engine, you can follow the steps and figure out the impact that it's going to have. Whereas a bowl of spaghetti is complex. It may only have like 3 or 4 ingredients, but once you start pulling out one strand, one noodle, you have no idea how it's going to impact the rest of the system. We live in a complex world. And I think part of the challenge that philanthropy has historically run up against is that that philanthropy believes that we live in a complicated world. And if we just think hard enough, we can develop a 5-year strategic work plan towards liberation. There's no work plan for healing, and there's no metric for healing, and there's no like work plan, strategic plan for liberation. And I think the more that foundations and philanthropy can begin to use faith and trust and relationship as a metric and stop seeing themselves as a financial institution whose relationships with their grantees are based on the money that exchanges hands, but to know that there's a relationship that's actually way deeper than money. You know, like if we're working for social change, what does it mean for a foundation to base their relationships on money? And on dirty money at that, right? The dirty secret about me is that I actually spent 10 years working in philanthropy years ago. And I sometimes felt like we were like a money laundering operation where a lot of grantees felt good taking money from us because we were a social justice foundation, but we get our money from the wealthiest people in the world, right? And so it's, you know, the money, like Tracy was saying earlier, like it comes from violence. And so what does it mean for a foundation that talks about social change to base their relationship with the grantees on that? And so really grateful to be here with a place like Kataly who gets that, like that's the relationships need to be based on something deeper than that. And so, yeah, grateful for this opportunity to be here with everyone from Kataly as well as Tracy and Prentis. And yeah, we're gonna be here for a few more generations. Our organization has been thinking about building a 250-year work plan. And you know, part of that is like having a vision of where we want to be in 250 years and knowing what we need to do tomorrow and along the way. So
thank you, Kazu. And I will have to congratulate Prentis in parenthood. He's bringing in the next generation. But I also wanted, Prentis, if there's any last words, I want to give you this last minute because I know folks would probably stay on here if we wanted to. But wanted to also ask you if there's any closing words you have also.
No, I don't want to keep people, but thank you so much for being able to have this conversation, and thank you to Kazu and Tracy for just everything that you do and everything that you're bringing. I feel grateful that we were able to have the conversation in this way. There is so much more to say about it, and I hope that Kazu, I've known you for a little bit, and Tracy, I'm just meeting you, but I would like to continue this connection, and grateful to Kataly Foundation for making this happen. That's it. Grateful.
Thank you, Prentis. Thank you, Tracy. Thank you, Kazu. Donna, Larry, thank you so much for your leadership and work and the full Kataly team. I'm going to pass it to Zainab, who's going to give us a little bit of the logistics. And thank you to our folks who joined us today for this joyful and precious and very complex conversation. Hope you feel restored and supported and inspired. So, Zainab.
Thank you so much, Kimmy. And yes, just a huge, huge thank you again to our incredible, powerful panelists, and to Donna and Larry as well for sharing so many beautiful reflections and insights. And thanks to everyone for making the time for this conversation. Just wanted to share some quick next steps. We will be having our final webinar in this series with the Restorative Economies Fund on Wednesday, November 10th at 10 a.m. Pacific time, 1 p.m. Eastern time. And I'll send around a link to register to that webinar for those of you who are interested in attending. Also invite everyone to continue to follow the conversation on Twitter with the hashtag Let's Talk Power. We'll be sharing some of the visions from our grantee partners, including some of the ones you've just heard from today, around what philanthropy can really do to show up differently in this moment, and really hope that everyone can take in those perspectives. So yes, thanks again for joining. We will be sending around a recording of this webinar, and we know we didn't get to some of the questions that were shared, but we'll be in touch with our panelists and see if there's a way for us to follow up with some reflections and answers later. So thank you again to everyone.
Oh my God, y'all are amazing.
I'm so sorry I rambled so much.
Oh my God,
I'm so
Tracy,
sorry.
you were
I woke
amazing.
up like really, really angry today because
No,
stuff went down yesterday, and I was just like, all the things. I was like, man, I'm tired of this stuff.
I'm so glad. I'm so glad you brought the fire. Did you see all the love that you were getting in the chat? It was amazing. Yeah, it was beautiful. I loved it.
Hey, you guys, this
Don't
is being
apologize.
broadcast. This is being broadcast.
Yes. There's still 45 people listening to you.
Oh, whoops. That's okay.
Special invite
Hi,
to the
everyone.
after party. I say if they made it this long, they get a few bonus minutes. You know, it's like when you watch the credits in the movie and then you get a little
Yes.
something.
Is there
Yeah, all
another
the Marvel
scene in the
movies has
Marvel
the end
movie?
credit
Yes,
scene.
That's right. I see. Yeah, people are still in the chat saying they don't want to go.
We really are in relationship.
Well, even for the people who are still listening, just, oh my gosh, thank you so much, Prentis and Tracy and Kazu. It was just beautiful. Yeah, it was so awesome. It was like beyond what we could have imagined. Just loved hearing you all in conversation. And yeah,